I'll be here today. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, we're running a little over, as you guessed. So, Cameron, I think you can speak for the next 30 minutes, unless maybe you have to leave about 2-ish. Yep. Then we'll do Q&A for the remainder of the time period. Just to introduce Cameron, he's served as Special Assistant and aide to the former US Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. He's Associate to the Chief Information Officer of leading Arab field, the Consolidated Contractors Company. He's a consultant to Qatari Diar, which is Qatar's state-backed real estate developer. And his business writings have been published by Stanford Graduate School of Business. So, very good experience. He's also had experience in Kurdistan, which is what he's going to talk about today. Cameron holds a Master in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Stanford, Master in Public Policy from Oxford, and Bachelor of Arts from Stanford again, so clearly a smart cookie. Look forward to your thoughts and your questions at the end, as usual. Thanks very much.
يسعدني وجودي بينكم. مرحبا بالسادة الحضور، مرحبا بالسادة الأساتذة، مرحبا بالطلاب. أشكر مركز دراسات الشرق الأوسط الدعوة الكريم. Thank you, Robert. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm very sorry about the traffic in Cairo. I wanted to be here earlier, but in the interest of time, I will cut some of my remarks, dig right into the topic here, which are the various pipelines that crisscross northern Iraq and have very significant geopolitical implications. And then I'll try to save some time for Q&A, and that should be more interesting. This is very much an unfolding situation, so I'm delighted to see so much interest. We had a very important referendum just a few days ago in Iraqi Kurdistan, and yesterday the former Iraqi president and a Kurd himself, Mr. Sulaimani, passed away. So Kurdistan is very much in the news, and let's seize the moment to talk about what's happening there and understand what's going on and try to extract some lessons. So I'm going to hope that everyone did their homework, and I won't have to spend time on the energy context and the political context in Kurdistan, and we can talk more about the current status quo and the future. But again, Kurdistan is a semi-autonomous region in northern Iraq, landlocked, really dependent on the goodwill for its energy and economic and political security of its neighbors. It is a country a region that has desperately been seeking independence for over 100 years and has a difficult set of cards because of its geography. And that's what makes its energy aspirations so important. Something like 95% of its GDP is based on its oil revenue, and without an avenue to monetize its energy assets, it simply cannot succeed as a new state or even a successful region of Iraq. So the Iraqi Kurds see hydrocarbons as this ticket toward the long-sought dream of an independent state. While the details of a proposed pipeline are being tightly controlled, the negotiations are playing out against a backdrop of extreme security and economic volatility, as well as political factionalism. There have been three kind of external shocks recently that are shaping this debate. The first, of course, is the rise of the Islamic State and the disruption they've caused within Iraq and the region more broadly. Besides the obvious military fight and resources that have been committed to that fight, there's also been a surge in internally displaced people within Iraq who have many of whom, millions of whom, have ended up in the Kurdish region. Secondly, we've had a period of very low oil prices, which has compounded the economic impacts on the Kurdish economy. And thirdly, there's been a great political factionalism within the Kurdish region itself. Many people forget that, in fact, Kurdish factions waged a civil war in the 1990s, a bloody war in northern Iraq between two Kurdish communities that largely stemmed from a void that was created when Saddam was contained in his box by UN sanctions. So ironically, even though the international community succeeded in its ambitions of keeping Saddam away from Kurdistan and committing more atrocities, as we all remember in Halabja and the Anfal campaign and various genocidal tendencies, although Saddam was kept in check in the 90s, it allowed these Kurdish expressions of power to come into conflict with one another. And we're seeing these again today. And we can see that just in looking at the presidency. Masoud Barzani, the president of the Kurdistan region, his term expired in 2013. He won a 2-year extension to 2015, and currently is still in power without any kind of extension. The parliament's been frozen, and there are upcoming elections for the presidency in northern Iraq set for November 1, but currently there are no candidates who have actually filed to be a part of this election, so it's likely they won't actually happen, and Mr. Barzani will stay in power. So when we're thinking about these energy issues, we have to think about them on the local level, on the national level within Iraq, the regional level, Kurdistan and its neighbors, and on the international level. But my thesis will focus on local drivers of these pipeline negotiations. So, what I'm here to talk about? Well, there's an existing energy infrastructure that allows Kurdistan to export its oil through a pipeline that goes up to Turkey and goes west to Ceyhan. And it is able to monetize its energy that way through the Mediterranean port. And there have been discussions since 2014 about an alternative route, which on paper makes a lot of sense. More opportunity to diversify its export routes can potentially lower the risk. Where would this pipeline go? It would go across the border from Iraqi Kurdistan to Iran and into the Iranian energy infrastructure that will allow it to then monetize its exports through the Persian Gulf. So 2 paths. And the question is, what is the state of these negotiations? Will this ever happen? And what are the implications? Independent analysts at the Iraq Oil Report have called the prospect of the deal highly impractical, political theater. The KDP insists it will continue to diversify its export routes, but with no actionable timetable given. Baghdad has allegedly offered its blessing to the deal so long as the pipeline originates in the oil-rich city of Kirkuk, one of the disputed territories. And reports indicate that Iran has actually already signed the deal and is applying pressure to obtain a response from the KRG. And yet this deal is completely at odds with the United States policy of one Iraq, where international energy deals are meant to be administered by the Iraqi federal government. And that is, of course, unless the Kurdish region declares independence and then gains its own sovereign right to handle energy affairs itself. With regards to the Trump administration, their policy towards Iraq, the Kurds, and generally the Iraq-Iranian relationship is still unclear, although there are signs that they want to take a tougher stance on Iran. The big debate within Washington right now is whether there are going to be changes to the opening up Iran with the nuclear agreement. And this is, of course, saying nothing about the Sunni-majority neighbors, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, who would respond aggressively to any kind of Kurdish rapprochement with Shia Iran. But the Kurds are in desperate need of an economic jolt. They're $20 billion in debt. They owe money to a variety of parties, including international oil companies and Turkey. So what risks are they willing to take? and how are they going to time these risks and link these issues with their broader strategic goals, largely independence. Now allow me to skip a little bit through the energy context. And we'll talk about the existing infrastructure, what's currently there on the ground right now. The story of Iraqi oil is largely one of underperformance, I would argue. Dr. Damir al-Galban, energy advisor to Prime Minister Abadi, said that the building blocks for the energy sector in Iraq are very strong. There are abundant reserves. There's low technical risk, meaning these are on-land assets. They're not highly challenging and risky offshore, underwater, deep water assets. And they're low production costs. So Iraq has major competitive advantages when it comes to making money off of its extractives compared to other countries. And yet, production levels are still below output levels of 1979. So what's going wrong here? With regard to crude, Iraq is the second largest producer in OPEC, fifth largest holder of proven reserves in the world. The deposits are known. These aren't unknown reserves. Things could come together if they manage to align their policies in the right way. What are some other advantages? Due to the country's upstream position in the energy supply chain, right, they're an extractive country, they're not so much a midstream or downstream country. The energy sector is capital intensive, and it fails to produce jobs that are commensurate with the investments. So there's a development of labor-heavy downstream energy in other countries that could potentially be a growth opportunity. Essentially, the money's pouring in to get the oil out of the ground, but it's not going into creating new jobs, and it's not in a refining capacity. It's an extractive capacity, and that's one of the big problems. So since 2004, the KRG has been exporting oil independently through a pipeline that it built that connects Kurdish oil fields to the Iraq-Turkey pipeline. So this is what you're seeing here, cutting across Ceyhan in Turkey. The Kurdish oil fields connect to the ITP at a point on the Kurdish side of the Turkish border. So just right here at this junction called Fishkabur. And the ITP runs west from Kirkuk into the main north-south export pipeline owned by the Iraqi state-owned North Oil Company. So this is the line here that you're seeing that's been in existence for a long time, run by the Northern Oil Company of Iraq. There are actually two parallel pipelines, 46 and 40 inches in diameter, and the ITP was used by the Iraqi government to export oil for Iraq's northern fields. This is mainly sourced from Kirkuk. The connection point is north of the ITP metering station, but south of the Turkish border. So this essentially allowed Kurdistan to tap into the western leg to Ceyhan without having any kind of intervention or control from Baghdad. Here's a close-up of Kurdistan region of Iraq, and you can see the junction point here at Fishkabur, and how they built their own infrastructure to completely bypass the central government's control. And we'll talk more about this critical region right here in the disputed territories. The yellow is based on the 1991 borders of the Kurdistan region, and the light green is de facto under Kurdish control, but largely part of the disputed territories in the news right now. The post-2003 grand deal between Baghdad and the KRG called for a 17% annual budget transfer to the Kurdish region in return for the Kurdish oil fields supplying the ITP. But for a number of reasons, disputes arose, and Baghdad stopped making this 70% annual budget transfer, hence pushing the Kurds to build up their own infrastructure apart from the ITP so they can export it. There have been a number of problems on this one route that the Kurds managed to develop. In particular, last February, March, there was a complete 3-week-long outage that hit oil markets hard. The reason for this outage is still unclear, but there are a number of problems. There was theft from the PKK, from the IS. There were normal electrical issues, benign malfunctions, and there were reports that Ankara had cut the line in order to squeeze the PKK because there are internal issues in Turkey as well that affect this pipeline. So although they've been able to monetize this route, there have been significant challenges, which is also encouraging them to think broadly about another route outside of Kurdistan. And finally, the oil that actually does come to market has been reported to be sour, meaning its quality has been diminished and they can't make as much per barrel as they would like to if the quality were better. And there's also a discount of around $10 per barrel off from Brent based on political and legal risk. So if they can find a more stable path to market, they can increase their returns per barrel. And some of the things that affect the quality are the distance the oil needs to travel. The shorter path, generally speaking, the better. Okay, so now let's talk specifically about this proposal for a second pipeline. The talks began in 2014, but regained a sense of urgency in March 2016, prompted by this 3-week outage that I talked about. The main proposed oil pipeline can carry anywhere between 250,000 to 400,000 barrels per day. To put that in perspective, right now the KRG is exporting around 600,000 barrels per day. So this is the capacity to make a step change in their exports. The deal is being negotiated with multiple arrangements. One is Kurdish crude for Iranian refined petroleum. So Kurdistan does not have the refining capacity, or northern Iran does. Crude goes one way, refined products go back the other. There's another arrangement, permission for the Kurds to sell Iranian oil from the Persian Gulf ports in some kind of oil swap, where then Iran is able to use KRG oil in their northern Iran refineries instead of pumping their own crude north. So that's going to bring down costs for Iran. There's another swap arrangement, Kurdish crude for Iranian gas. Right now, Kurdistan has lots of known gas reserves, but they're not currently exploited. And then there's another alternative of just Iranian cash loans for exploration stakes in Kurdish oil fields. There should be about 20 new plots open for bidding in 2018, and there could be some kind of right of first refusal agreement given to Iran. Okay, why would this deal make sense? An energy deal between the KRG and Iran has its rationale because the KRG has expressed its interest in diversifying. The Asian markets are attractive. That can be tapped through the Persian Gulf as opposed to the Mediterranean. It's a shorter path. Quality will be better. There's also already 400 to 500 daily oil tankers trucks that deliver Kurdish crude over the border to Iran, something the locals call a pipe on wheels. So this would essentially be just institutionalizing a path to the market that's already there, just in a different form. And there are major problems in the roads, as you can imagine, with 400 to 500 oil tanker trucks going on these roadways. So this would be a way to actually improve another category of infrastructure in Kurdistan. We've mentioned already the enormous amount, the leap that Kurdistan can make in its barrels per day exported, and the economic windfall that could arise from that. Finally, Iran is open for business again now, with many of the sanctions off. It doesn't mean all the risks have been mitigated, but there's a new level of engagement that's possible from the international community and from direct neighbors as well. There are many questions that remain that keep me up. What is the route, first and foremost? And there's no definitive explanation. Any pipeline will face challenges in approving its right-of-way. That's just the nature of any kind of pipeline. The path will be guided by the primary function. We talked about the arrangements. Will it be crude for refined products? Will there be gas? Will it be simply an arrangement with the Persian Gulf port? Those considerations will direct the route. But what we do know is it would likely go through Parvez Khan, which is a current Kurdish-Iranian border crossing south of Halabja. Halabja is just down here, where the genocide took place in the early 90s, late 80s. And Parvez Khan is just further down here. It would likely pass through there because it is a border crossing controlled by the opposition to the KDP, the ruling party that makes up Barzani's government, the Kurdish regional government, the KRG. This is controlled by the PUK. And traditionally, the two factions in Kurdistan, the PUK and the KDP, one has been closely aligned with Iran and the other closely aligned with Turkey, although the relationship with Turkey is much more pronounced because the KDP is, of course, the party in power. It has been for a long time. On the other end, besides the border crossing, the question is, will it be sourced from Kirkuk? And that's where the question of independence and a new border comes in and really determines whether this pipeline will take shape. I like this map, although if you can bear with the detail for a minute, because it goes to show how complicated it will be to source from Kirkuk, because this is the field and these are individual wells, and you can't just slice and dice. With a big field like that, you're going to optimize your output when all parties extracting are in coordination. And that's according to experts at BP who found this field in 1923 and put Kirkuk on the map. And so currently, although the Peshmerga and the Kurds have de facto control over this region, they recently came into an agreement with the central government, brokered by the United States, to send 150,000 barrels per day to the central government. But it's all more or less under control by the Kurds. So it appears this is going to be something to be negotiated. It doesn't seem like any party is willing to use a serious threat of force to dictate the future of Kirkuk, but we can talk about that further in a minute. So here's a little bit of a framework that I use to think about what's happening here. I won't spend too much time on this, so we can move on to Q&A and talk about actual stakeholder interests, how Turkey, how Iran, how the United States is looking at this. But again, I mentioned you have to look about it in terms of local drivers the relationship with Baghdad, the neighbors, and the influence of the international community, which of course is led by the United States in Iraq, but it includes the United Nations and the coalition fighting the Islamic State. And there are typical political science challenges here: asymmetrical information, the principal agent problem. Just in my research, it's been very challenging to figure out which claims are valid because of different incentives just within Kurdistan. And there's a lot of bluster in this region, which is no news to anyone. There are a lot of empty threats, as we've seen just since the referendum results and the past week, what's happened. And so it's a question of what is short-term posturing and what is actually a long-term strategic aim. A lot of these issues are linked together. There's the economics at play that is driving the behavior of the Kurds in many ways because they are so deeply in need of support. And because they're not an independent state, they can't appeal to traditional sources of economic help that a normal country would be able to, such as the IMF, monetary assistance, adjustments from a central bank. I mean, they don't have these kinds of institutions, and they don't have access to them because they're not officially recognized as a state. Okay, so at the domestic level, within northern Iraq, within the Kurdistan region of Iraq, the primary stakeholders are the KDP, the PUK, and the government in Baghdad. There's an uneasy power balance between the KDP and the PUK. There is, of course, a strong bond because they're all Kurds, and that comes first in one's sense of identity in this part of the world. But there are many other divides after that. Sunni, Shia, historical ties with Iran, given the close proximity along the border. During the Iran-Iraq War, for example, Iran took many Kurds running from Saddam's campaign. So there are still good feelings of goodwill in this part of southern Kurdistan towards Iran. I even saw that a statement that there are plenty of people in the Sulaimani province who would rather stay a part of Iraq than be ruled by a dictator in Erbil. It's not a majority by any means. The referendum clearly shows that there's an overwhelming feeling towards independence in Kurdistan, but there is a significant opposition that either did not go to the polls or has remained in opposition, but is not in the majority. In terms of the regional dynamics, the net power balance here in this particular part of Iraq has formed along two lines. The KDP, along with Turkey and the Gulf countries, versus the PUK, along with Iran, Baghdad, another opposition party in Kurdistan called Iran, the Change Party, and the PYD. The Gulf GCC Turkey alliance is one that's familiar to everyone here, that's been following the Qatar blockade of sorts. It's a Sunni bloc that has been trying for many years to resist Iranian encroachment and intervention in the region. And this is certainly one that it appears the United States is supporting more overtly now. So the divide among the Kurds helps explain why a senior spokesman for the KRG told me that there is no agreement or memorandum of understanding with the Iranians with regards to a pipeline, which is completely in contradiction to what I've heard from PUK officials. There's just no acknowledgement within Kurdistan. I won't labor on the historical relationship between Turkey, Israel, and Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis Kurdistan, because it's just not, Israel and Saudi Arabia do not have that much agency right now. This is really about Turkey and Iran, and who's going to be the better, more reliable energy partner. How is Baghdad going to handle that, and what is the United States going to do to move the needle? And even considering Turkey's considerable relationship with Kurdistan, they have their own problems. There's violent terrorism. There was a mass attack on New Year's Eve. The Russian ambassador was assassinated. They're continually having issues with their own Kurdish population. So this is not just about what Turkey wants to do within Kurdistan. It's about how Turkey is dealing with its own issues. As a side note, one of their big concerns is this kind of Kurdish corridor, which has the potential to extend all the way to the Mediterranean. This kind of path for energy would be a tribute to the historic Trans-Syrian pipeline, which for 40 years pumped crude from Kirkuk to the Mediterranean through Syria. And this was active until Hafez al-Assad, his regime, sided with the Iranian revolutionaries in the Iran-Iraq War and abandoned the line in 1988. So there's some precedence for this kind of path that's certainly of concern to Turkey. Saudi Arabia is, again, on a second level of influence here. They're not driving events on the ground by any means, but 75% of the Iraqi Kurdish population is Sunni Muslim, and so there is a strong feeling of goodwill there. Officially, the government has said they have no stance on this proposal. Okay, so how does Iran see this? They're against a secession of Kurdistan from Iraq because it would be a weakening of their Shia-led Iraqi government. Recently, there were reports that Barzani's camp has said the referendum is not about secession from Iraq. It's about secession from Iran. Think about that. That's the threat that they feel right now from Iranian influence in their country, in their region. This comes in a variety of forms from the PMUs, the Hafez al-Shabi, that have been part of the Peshmerga and International Coalition fighting against the Islamic State. So they're been pressing into historic Sunni lands, and there have been conflicts, obviously, on a confessional basis after the IS has been removed, about the future of the land, the future of this community's resettlement. But for Iran, the pipeline provides a lot of political benefit, more than economic benefit, because Iran already has refining capacity, it has oil, it has gas, and it just doesn't need this the way that the Iraqi Kurds need this. So the KRG's economic dependence on Iran is there. It's more important than the other way around, but it also pales in comparison to its dependence on Turkey. Something like $8 to $9 billion of investment trade between Turkey and the Kurdish region of Iraq. This is in the oil business, but also in consumer goods and food products, and it works both ways. So it's although there have been some threats out of Turkey recently post-referendum, it's not actually in Turkey's economic interest to seal the border, close down the pipeline. They will suffer, and they're not in a particularly stable position to be able to accommodate that kind of hit. I would say chief among Iran's interests is maintaining Iraq's territorial integrity and halting secession. And one of the ways they play this game is through their horse in the race, which is former Prime Minister Maliki, who was openly challenged, Prime Minister Abadi. He has the presidential elections coming up in February, and Abadi knows to win that election and to shore up his support in Parliament, he needs to count on the Kurdish bloc, which so far has come through, but of course if they become independent, will not be eligible to vote for him, meaning that there's a risk of a more Iranian-aligned government in Iraq. That threat of a stronger Iranian influence in Iraq raises red flags for the United States, given their presence and investment in the country. So the question is, not just what does the U.S. think about the referendum, but how would they consider this deal between the Kurds and the Iranians? And would they actually do anything about it? I mentioned already the one Iraq policy. We've seen that in their expressions after the referendum. They're disappointed. They were not for this. They tried a last-minute halt to the vote, and they failed. They're focused on fighting the Islamic State. They see Kurdish pushes for independence as destabilizing, and this kind of connection is not one that's going to further U.S. interests. The route is not that significant. It's only between two countries or regions. The volume isn't that great from the U.S. perspective. From the Kurdish perspective, it's a game changer, but from the U.S. perspective, it's not so significant. And they're really worried, again, about kind of this Hezbollahization of Iraq, kind of a Shia crescent that could extend all the way from Iran to the Mediterranean. This is nothing new. This is what they've been concerned about for decades. It's important to note that while the U.S. has a view, it does not necessarily constrain the actions of international oil companies. ExxonMobil defied the guidance of the United States in 2011 by completing exploration deals for 6 blocks in Kurdish oil fields. This was a defiance of U.S. policy because they dealt directly with the Kurds as opposed to dealing with central government in Baghdad. And this precedence opened the door for mid-sized firms, which, after some threats from Baghdad, decided to fill the gap when Exxon pulled out. Essentially, the big guys were told, you invest in Kurdistan and you lose your privileges in southern Iraq. And the assets of the big oil majors in southern Iraq are far more significant than a few blocks in Kurdistan. So they said, okay, we get it. We'll stick to the south. And that opened the door for mid-sized companies, Ganel, DNO, and a few others to come in. Recently there's been a lot of activity from Russia. Russia's Rosneft has just invested $1 billion in the energy space in Kurdistan, mostly in gas. They're trying to build up Turkey as kind of their energy hub. And they see Kurdistan as a great way of sourcing Turkey's gas and Europe's gas in that sense as well. So there's a lot of activity. I bring up Russia because the question now is, well, if the U.S. is not going to be actively engaged, do we want Russia now to dictate events in this region and determine how far Iran can go? I think the U.S. has learned a pretty difficult lesson about the consequences of pulling out in Syria vis-a-vis Russia, where now the Russians are really determining the facts on the ground in that country more than the United States. Before we get to the referendum, I just want to conclude a little bit about then, okay, so what? What's going to happen? What can we expect? From a U.S. standpoint, the KRG-Iran deal is problematic, and it's unlikely. It's also politically and economically irrelevant. And this suggests that actually domestic Kurdish stakeholders have the most agency in driving the outcome of the deal. And that's why I focus so much on the intricacies of the relationship between the PUK, the KDP vis-a-vis Baghdad, because they're the ones who are really going to determine the outcome here. And in an era of low oil prices, the politics really trump the economics as the primary driver here. rather than uniting the Kurds, unfortunately, their oil assets have divided them. The pipeline deal with Iran could allow the ruling parties in Sulaimani to cash in on oil they control. That would be against the KDP. So even within Kurdistan, there's a nasty fight over access and power and monetization of these assets. Kirkuk is not just about central government Kurdistan. It's also about families and parties within Kurdistan. Outside investors will say to Kurdistan, look, it's time to focus on the above-ground issues. They're less interested in the politics here. They're interested in building Kurdish institutions, improving good governance in the region, increasing transparency. Those are the things that will determine whether an international oil company will come and partner with the Kurds, independent or not. And those concerns, which are widely held in the region, give cause for caution when it comes to independence. Because you can ask, what good is independence if the underlying state is not ready? You can also say there's no good time. They've been wanting this for decades. But it is a very interesting question indeed. So while the technical preparations for the pipeline are certainly underway, regardless of denials from Erbil, it appears that this deal was really only strategically compelling if it were carried out by a unified Kurdistan region of Iraq, with the aim of helping and risk-proofing the energy industry. So this is counterintuitive. What seems like a sound economic and energy policy, a new pipeline to Iran that would allow the KRG to spread their oil exports across 2 routes to boost their efforts at independence from Baghdad and their dependence on Ankara, will likely in fact have negative collateral effects given the fractures in the Kurdish house. I have a few other thoughts that I'd like to address in the Q&A, and perhaps we can talk about the rest of the Q&A as well. Thank you very much.